Good afternoon. Today I'm going to be talking to you about school safety and violence and the disconnect that often occurs between the perception of the public and the reality of the actual numbers and the data that exist on school violence and safety. When you think of school violence and safety issues, well, first of all, for violence, you often think about the unfortunate incidents that have occurred in the last 20 years. For instance, Georgia Tech, Nickel Mines, Pennsylvania, and the Amish school, Bethel High School and the student shooting that occurred there, Columbine, of course, and the tragedy that occurred in 1999, and then, of course, Sandy Hook, that unfortunate incident that took place in 2012. When you think about school safety, you often think about metal detectors, video surveillance cameras throughout our hallways, entry buzzers that have become the norm in many elementary schools, especially throughout my own district. You think about increased security presence, laying on of more security officers and security at different functions. And then finally, we even have police officers that are on campuses across the United States. So what I did was to kind of test out this theory in a very simple format. I created on Google Docs a survey that I then made available to all the people that I have on my Facebook. 66 people ended up responding, and of those responses, of the 5 questions that I formulated, I focused on 2 main questions. How safe are schools compared to schools 20 years ago? And then how violent are schools compared to schools 20 years ago? The respondents responded to, all 66 responded to all the questions, and I got a good sample from that particular response. On the first question, how safe are schools compared to 20 years ago? The survey of the respondents said that at least 77% of the respondents felt that schools were either as safe or that they were somewhat less safe or significantly less safe than they were 20 years ago. When I asked the same question about how much more violent schools are than 20 years ago, 92% of the respondents felt that schools were either as violent, a little bit more violent, or significantly more violent than they were 20 years ago. As a matter of fact, nearly half of the respondents felt that schools were significantly more violent than they were as they remembered them 20 years ago. But when you look at the actual reality of the numbers, actual data that is taken from surveys of students, of staff, of administrators at the actual schools, several things come to the forefront when you look at that data. For instance, when you're talking about serious violent incidents that occur on campuses, for every 1,000 students in 1994, there were 13 serious violent incidents that students could recount. But in 2007, the latest data that was available for this particular survey, 4 in every 1,000 students felt that they had been the victim of a serious violent incident. That's down 325% over the course of approximately 13 years. When you look at another data point, students reported carrying weapons to school in the last 30 days. In 1993, there were 23 incidents of students admitting to carrying weapons to school in the last 30 days. By 2009, that number had decreased to 11 out of every 1,000 students who had admitted to carrying weapons within the last 30 days to school. That's a decrease of 209% over the course of almost 20 years. Now, when we talk about very serious violent incidents, when we talk about the incidents like Columbine, of course, we're talking about homicides. And the reality is that homicides dropped in 1993 from 42 to only 2 in 2010 on campuses across the United States. That's a drop of over 2,000%. Now, surely there are spikes over that period of time such as during the Sandy Hook incident, but the reality is that schools have significantly dropped in the number of homicides that have occurred. What are the conclusions that can be drawn? Well, very simply, the general public thinks that schools are more violent and generally not as safe as they were 20 years ago, when the statistics actually would say that schools are significantly less violent and substantially safer than they were 20 years ago. Therein lies the disconnect that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation. For more information and more data on these and other school violence and safety issues, you can visit the School Youth Violence Project, which is at the Curry School of Education on the campus of the University of Virginia. And here is the website. My name is David Marks, and I'm a educational leadership doctoral student for Northern Arizona University. And here is my email address.